Book review. All right. I have Bloodlands by Europe between Hitler and Stalin. Timothy Snyder. Okay. So this book, you're probably somewhat familiar with it. It's a relatively recent book. It's something like a decade old. You've probably seen it at Barnes and Noble or whatever, and I'm somewhat familiar. It made a big splash, and I think it's. Yeah, I'm just getting around to reading this, and it's definitely. I think it's good. I think the book is a good influence. I don't know. Anyone who's really read it might be a refreshing take. I mean, it seemed like a cool concept. Like you can kind of grasp immediately what the concept is. I mean, it's Bloodlands, and it's Europe between. So it's a geographic area between Hitler and Stalin. So this is 1933 and 1945, and Tim Snyder is tallying up like 14 million dead, basically non non-combat fatality, um, in this time and place, the Bloodlands. So he's reframing he's reframing some historical things for this concept, and he refers back on it. But it makes for an interesting way to look at things. It definitely brings up, so you could see how, I mean, these things like the dynamic between Hitler and Stalin, how they played off of each other, and how communism and fascism played off. It might seem obvious, but then but it's not. I mean, or at least it's not presented that way. It might seem obvious, but people aren't necessarily presented the facts this way that these things didn't really happen in a vacuum. So it gets into say famines in the Soviet Union. It goes. I mean, you figure right off the bat, the time frame. I mean, he goes into how the Soviets figure this, that maybe the Russians, it's natural that they communal farming. Okay, so communal farming is natural, it's a traditional thing for Russians. So they took to it, like it's nothing. When Bolsheviks come along, and these are Russians, and they make the collective farms. It's just what they've been doing. Ukrainians are different, and so this is where problems arise. So so this is maybe immediately where you see that these aren't, say, how Russians now claim them to be, where, because communal farming is a natural thing for Russians, and then Ukrainians are more, they don't really take to it, and it creates like new classes of people, like kulaks, who are basically just people who've gotten in trouble in some capacity with the Soviet regime, with the Russian communist regime. So after they take over Ukraine, they start to forcibly collectivize everybody. So I mean, you could just imagine that you're forced onto some collective farm, and then you own nothing, and then the government is communist, and they run everything, and then and then and then they hate you, and then just food just stops coming, and you can't go anywhere because it's the Soviet Union, and they don't let you go anywhere, and you just starve. And so there's like millions of people who are starving, and even this agricultural territory, because now all the food belongs to, is collected. And so everything's collected, and you're allowed to take nothing for yourself. And they put watchtowers up when people begin to starve, so that if peasants try to take food from the field, the communist activists who man these watchtowers can catch them and then they'd be sentenced to death for stealing socialist property as an enemy of the people. So that's how Russians ran things, and in this way and then they just ruthlessly collect everything. So they're just taking collection after collection of grain, and then they cease any distribution for all the Ukrainian territories, and what's really a purposeful genocide and an attempt to wipe out people. I mean, it seems pretty clear, but this is a murderous regime the whole murderous program, and this went on for a long time with Westerners who are willing to lie about it. And at the time, it was the mainstream thing was to lie for Russia. The mainstream media lied for Russia back then because Russia was communist. So this was a big benefit to them being officially proclaiming themselves to be communist, because it meant that all Western media was sympathetic to them. And the Germans, Hitler, in his speeches from the start, in his speeches when he would actually to get elected, Hitler was bringing up, the Soviets are starving Ukrainians. And this became a thing where even after Hitler gets in power, I mean, there's years are going by. Most of the Third Reich before World War II, I mean, there aren't mass killings, there at all. There's like a few dozen people died in like Night of the Long Knives who were they were like the Ernst Röhm faction. They're Nazis themselves, and meanwhile in the Soviet Union at the same time, I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of people being killed, but people in the West are lying about it because they don't want to be considered a Nazi by like repeating Nazi propaganda, and so then they'd reframe. For the Russians, they'd say a starving Ukrainian peasant is a fascist, by definition, because he's an enemy of the communist state, So, but there are however many people in the West at the time. It's not just dissident communists. It's actually a large majority of the mainstream media, any kind of liberal left-leaning. There are a lot of people who are apologizing for what was going on in the Soviet Union while they're killing all these people. And even people who later would be kind of put on a pedestal like they're the moral like lights in the darkness of the 20th century or something, where people who lied for the Soviet Union while they're killing all these people. And so the book, it reframes a lot. It takes a look at the whole thing it kind of takes a look at it in a different light. And I mean, it's not a big book. It's 400 pages, but for the subject matter, it's not it goes through, a lot of it is just vivid descriptions of like concentration camps and like death camps and like, how the NKVD killed people, how the SS killed people, how they carry out these mass killing operations, how this is done. And it's not that much philosophizing. The book, Tim Snyder is a liberal. The book, I would say, I would call this anti-communist. I would say it's anti-Russian. It sympathizes maybe with Poland, and Ukraine. More than he seems, but I mean, he's putting down facts, and I think he's criticized for this as well. You might figure he'd be criticized for the whole thing, even I mean, because this is kind of into the same territory as a maybe not revisionist, but maybe functionalist, like Ernst Nolte. I mean, it's not the same, but it's in the you can see why that was controversial. Why how this is kind of a shift in the scholarship in a way, but he does like there's no thesis here. Richard Evans, I saw he criticizes him Tim Snyder for there's no like causal thesis. There's no there should be more musings on like how people are do these things or something, but the book just kind of goes into what people did, like so it's more musings. There's a lot of anecdotal stuff, and it's a lot of reconstructions of events and seeing meaning in them in a way, but not necessarily getting really like it doesn't get into like what's the root cause of the whole thing. Even there's a chapter on like Stalin's anti-Semitism. That's what like the chapter's called, but it's kind of like it departs from the premise of the book in a way. I mean, it ties in, but you could see how it kind of departs from the premise. But it doesn't necessarily. It really just runs through like, how the Soviets would like their approach to Jews and their kind of conspiratorial thinking and how this manifested itself in different ways, especially after World War II. But it doesn't necessarily it doesn't like dig deep into like I don't know that much. Like after you read it, you're like, okay, I don't know, but I'm fine with that. And I think, but I think probably a lot of people who aren't familiar with this kind of stuff would be well served, especially to get some stuff about what went on in Ukraine. And I mean, it does a lot of interesting stuff. It like leans into this concept of like, but like Hitler does one thing, Stalin does another, and how what happens between them turns into something even beyond like I don't know like or like like how like Poles who fought they were sent to fight against Nazi Germany, they end up getting executed by Soviet Union, or even after World War II. There's Poles who the Russians would execute, even during World War II, they would execute Poles who'd fought against the Nazis because they'd figure that these would be the same Poles who would fight against them as well. And so they weren't any bit appreciative or anything. They had a total monopoly on anti-fascism. The book goes into how Russians came up with Antifa a little bit, like how they put the monopoly on good, and how if you're not with Moscow, then you're a fascist, you're evil, like. So this is Antifa is invented by Stalin, and so I mean, but it just goes into a lot of interesting anecdotal stuff. Like it goes into like the Travniki guys, like Ukrainians who Ukrainians are recruited by the Germans, obviously to I mean for like anyone who was captured by the Germans, for these Russians, you were pretty much done. And the Germans kind of played fast and loose with a lot of the stuff, like with the Russians, it seemed like they do these big killing operations, and they're kind of like they're like robots, like they're just like um, everything needs to be done a certain way. It needs to be, and they're probably just scared for their own lives. They kill all these people. With the Germans, it's like people are like they're always like laughing and kind of freewheeling. Like they have mission type orders going in, I guess, but they kind of in the book they just seem a lot wilder in their approach. Like they don't have a lot of translators. I mean, Germans would enforce the Commissar order by they'd say they'd capture a bunch of Russian soldiers, and they'd say if you're Jewish, a communist, or a commissar, step forward, and if you everyone who stepped forward was shot, and then everyone else just marched into big pens, and this is how the Germans really dealt with. It really is interesting after they starve all these people. The Russians, they starve like a whole nation of people, and then years later they're being starved themselves. And actually, the Germans were kind of inspired by that, and they kind of would they figured they could do the same to this territory, and it meant the same to them in a way. Like, and they looked at Russians in a way like they'll do the same to them. So the first thing the Germans did in the Soviet Union was they'd pretty much take every Russian soldier, and these Russians didn't really expect this, but they were rounded up in big pens, not like POW camps, but just like a barbed wire fence. And it would be around like a big just field, and they'd put like hundreds of thousands of Russian captured, because the Germans captured more Russian soldiers. No, there'd never been like huge amounts of troops captured like this ever. These are like the biggest envelopments in history. So the Germans would just put them in like they would just march them to like these big like it was just a barbed wire fence basically, and they'd put hundreds of thousands, and then they would just starve them, and they would just they're manning the whole thing, and they just wait for every one of them to just starve to death. And that's how they would take out these Russians. If you happen to be a Ukrainian, you might have a good out. If you were a recruit in the Soviet army, because the Germans would try to recruit you, like the Travniki, so you could get out of these pens, and so these guys would join. They signed up for the job, which was envisioned even by the Germans to be like police in the Soviet Union. Like these are Ukrainians, mostly recruited from like captured troops, and so the Germans figure they need like a police force for like when they capture the whole Soviet Union, because they'll have a huge expansive territory, and they'll need like a security force. So this will like be like the core of it, is what they were creating. But the problem is they didn't take the whole Soviet Union. So, but they still ended up with these guys. When they ended up using these, and the same thing, the Germans had however many Jews they'd rounded up, and they'd planned to deport them here or there, like maybe to Madagascar, but they couldn't get there because the British Navy, and then they couldn't, by not defeating the Soviet Union, they couldn't deport them like way to the east, which they really wanted to do. But so, I mean, what they came up with, they ended up coming up with these death camps where they had these Ukrainian guys who are, recruited, so you could see that then these guys, you could figure it. So these dudes made the bulk of the force of like Action Reinhard, because most of the foot soldiers of it were these Ukrainians, and some like, and then like a few German SS guys. But you figure these guys had they were really in a sticky situation. I mean, you could see these kind of situations where you have Hitler over here and you have Stalin over there, and so Stalin's trying to kill you, and then you're liberated, but you're liberated by by Hitler, and you could see how um, everything that's playing out, and so this book gets into all this stuff, and so you could see how you look at this, and it might give you some more perspective with all the Russians constantly. They're obsessed with World War II. They're obsessed with their rendition, their version of World War II, and why they have to call everyone's a Nazi, and why what this all means to them, how they really see the whole thing, and how cynical some of it is, where you know the way that they frame this stuff. So the book, I mean, it is an interesting book, especially just you see how maybe the Russians are what they're really like, and how they're just always slaughtering each other. I mean, this stuff is you see it playing out now. Like back then, they have all the Stalin would just kill people around him, and it's not that much different than like how Prigozhin went out and how Putin deals with these people. Stalin is on a somewhat of a different scale, but this could really shift. Like you could see the importance of what Ukraine meant for both parties involved, because this was the Germans noted, they say Ukraine is the surplus region, and then Belarus and Russia were the deficit regions. So the Germans figure that the Ukrainians have more than enough for everyone to eat. And the Germans were not entertaining Ukrainian nationalism, but the Ukrainians were very much friendly and with the Germans because their experience with the Soviets at the time, like whoever showed up, you'd be willing to you'd be willing to help. So you can kind of relate, and so now to reframe all these people now, they're all Nazis, and you look at the history or so forth. Maybe you kind of see where they're coming from, see why they don't maybe want to negotiate with people who would like starve you and things like that. Like it might give you a good idea. Like you see how much the Russians lie about it, how they can they get Westerners who are very naive, and they fall for their lies because they're not used to someone who's just like lying to them like so outrageously. so like a naive kind of person. But I'm getting off track. But yeah, the Ukraine, the surplus region. So for the Germans, and the Germans see Ukraine as like, this is going to change everything. And so they could really rewrite the rules on economics if they have this territory. Like they can make like the autarky. They can make like this empire, like a huge land empire that's completely self-sufficient. They'll have all the resources. And what Germans were looking at is Ukraine, breadbasket, and then beyond that also they needed oil, so into the Caucasus. But this is a huge deal for them. Like they envisioned like how all the settlements in the Crimea, because this is the surplus territory. There's all this drama now with all the grain and with Ukraine, but this is the territory. It's like black earth. I mean, it's a valuable territory. It's not. I mean, there's people who are acting like this is a worthless piece of real estate, and but actually Stalin looked at this like it's gonna change. It was gonna change the game for him, and all he needed to do is get rid of the Ukrainians off of this territory, and then the Soviet Union was like this, quite a thing. It could be the same now. Like if Russia was to be a big empire, they'd obviously they need to take Ukraine. This is the most obvious. They need this breadbasket region that could fuel like this huge territorial empire and like all this expansion and however much it would mean everything. It's not they don't just want the few ethnic Russians or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of people who seem to have a view in their mind, like Vladimir Putin. And like NATO is like this super aggressive fascist. Like they really believe the Russian propaganda. Like NATO's are like these aggressive Nazis and stuff. And like Vladimir Putin, his hand has been forced. You know, he really didn't want the war, but his hand has been forced by the aggressive NATO. I mean, it's such a joke. Like I don't know. I don't think imperialism is bad. I think it's good. But I think what Russians doing is like imperialism. It's just Russia is also bad. If Russia does it, it's no good. But in general, I mean, but they should be able to admit that that's what it is. You know, just admit that it is imperial. Like it is like an imperial conquest is what they're going for. It's not a self-defense type situation. It's a self-defense grab at Ukraine or something. It means the same thing. It should mean the same thing for Europe. It might even be that there's no real visionary in Europe, or there aren't people who really see what this could mean, say for the European Union or something like that. If not, then that should be the U.S.'s thing, because the U.S. should go in there. But yeah, but the Germans did see this territory as like they were actually trying to get along. After a while, they kind of blew their big opportunity that could have changed the game in terms of they could have like raised up like a huge Ukrainian army, but they weren't willing to do that. They thought they were going to win and they were going to subjugate the whole thing by themselves. It just didn't happen. but they'd sort of came around by the end of it. They'd almost begun to see the errors of their ways after it was too late. But it could be, I mean, this could mean however much, it should mean something to Europe, because it would change things with this territory that has been with the Russian sphere for however long, and it's a valuable territory, and it's moving to like Europe proper, and we're cutting off Moscow and Eurasia from, you know, we're prying those clutches off. So I mean, that could be a game changer. It almost seems like, you know, people aren't looking at it like that. I guess people don't look at it like that, but I think it's the way you could look at it, and I think it's how any it's a lot of how the people at play in this time. It's more in line of how they viewed this territory. I mean, Hitler. The book goes into how Hitler during 1918, the Germans had Ukraine. So, and this kind of colored his imagination. For a brief period, the Germans took this breadbasket and they had all this hope for it. Like it could have, you know, been something. So this changed something in his mind. But it's more or less, I mean, it's not inaccurate. And when the Germans showed up, Ukraine was the surplus region, and Belarus and Russia were the deficit. So for the Soviet Union, their calculations, if they could starve out the Ukrainians or they could take all their food, then they would take everything and more from Ukraine. They'd completely starve them and take all the food for themselves. So that worked out. Like, that's how they wanted to work. The Germans worked it a bit differently, where they were starving out, Petrograd. They're starving out Leningrad, and they're starving out others. But it's ironic how it played out. How different. You see big numbers get killed here, and then big numbers get killed there, and it's some of it is just so haphazard. Like, you see how maybe however many like normal people are getting caught up in this, is it's with people with these ideologies are coming at it with the magical thinking on who should be on the death list, and it's not necessarily who they're coming across in real life when they're just rounding people up in huge numbers. And I mean, it's an interesting book. I think there's new stuff in here. There's stuff that there's more detailed accounts of different things that I've been curious of. Snyder speaks a lot of languages, and he seems to do pretty well at coming up with kind of cool anecdotal stuff. Like, I think this is a cool book. It's I mean, for whatever, like, Snyder's background, he's a liberal, but I think his view, he has an agreeable view of history, that like it's something that history is something that you should learn from, that there are things in it that you might not expect going into, and that you should learn from. So maybe that's the criticism that he gets from Richard Evans, that he's not going into it with a causal thesis, and in a way he's presenting a series of facts. He's kind of musing over them, but it's you could read this, and there's very vivid descriptions of different how the NKVD round people up, how you keep people like surprised without panicking in these operations, it gives you a lot to kind of think about, and to think about how people are, like, if you're being gaslighted. But there's however many people in these situations who just found themselves unable to comprehend like the situation, like they're taken over by Russia or Germany, and they just couldn't figure out the motivations of the people who'd taken over, and who ultimately did them in. So it's definitely I think this book is worth a read for I mean, it kind of goes, it's revisionist, like it's I don't know, it's just worth a read, just on like it's kind of a different perspective. It's a different reframing of things, and especially with just Ukraine and Poland as well, and Russia, everything's really relevant. So it's worth checking out. I mean, the concept, it's somewhat arbitrary. I mean, some of it, like, it's kind of like cheesy, or like the Bloodlands, or but like he's always referring to like the Bloodlands. They were killed in the Bloodlands, but I don't know. A lot of people probably don't appreciate having their home called the Bloodlanders. I don't know. It's kind of, the book's worth checking out though, and even if you don't, I figured I enjoyed reading it, and I kind of figured I'd say a few things. But yeah, that's a positive book review for Tim Snyder for Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin.